June 19, 1944, Ensign Robert Burnett brought his F-6F Hellcat fighter into the landing pattern above USS Enterprise and realized something was terribly wrong. Burnett was a 23-year-old Navy pilot from Ohio, 6 months out of flight school, flying his first major combat mission. He had been in the air for nearly 5 hours, fighting Japanese aircraft in what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. His fuel gauge showed empty. His engine was coughing. He had maybe 2 minutes of flying time left before the engine quit completely. Below him, the carrier deck was packed with aircraft. Planes were landing every 30 seconds, but dozens more were circling, all low on fuel, all trying to land before they ran out of gas and crashed into the ocean. The sun was setting. Darkness was falling. And Burnett realized with growing horror that he couldn't see his own carrier, USS Lexington, anywhere in the formation. He was lost, almost out of fuel, and about to land on the wrong ship. What Burnett didn't know was that he was part of the largest carrier aviation disaster in American naval history. Over 80 aircraft were running out of fuel simultaneously after returning from the longest carrier strike mission ever attempted. In the next 2 hours, 49 planes would crash or ditch in the ocean. 16 pilots and aircrew would die, and the decisions made by one admiral during those desperate minutes would spark the closest thing to a mutiny the U.S. Navy experienced during World War II. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought on June 19, 1944, was the largest carrier battle of the Pacific War. The U.S. Navy's Task Force 58 consisted of 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers, 902 aircraft in total. The Japanese mobile fleet had 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 28 destroyers, 473 aircraft. The battle would determine control of the Mariana Islands and the future course of the Pacific War. June 19th became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American fighters slaughtered Japanese aircraft in massive dogfights. Japanese pilots, poorly trained replacements for veterans lost earlier in the war, flew obsolete aircraft into combat against American pilots in superior planes. The result was one-sided. By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost 395 aircraft. The Americans lost 30. It was the most decisive air victory in naval history. But the battle wasn't over. The Japanese fleet was retreating westward, damaged but still dangerous. Admiral Mitscher, commanding Task Force 58's carrier groups, wanted to launch a strike to finish off the Japanese carriers. The problem was range. The Japanese fleet was at the extreme limit of American aircraft range, over 300 miles away. A strike at that distance meant pilots would be returning after dark, low on fuel, to carriers they might not be able to find. Mitscher made the decision anyway. At 16:24 hours on June 20th, he launched 216 aircraft, every available bomber and torpedo plane, plus fighters for escort. The strike would find the Japanese fleet, attack at twilight, and return after dark. Pilots were told to expect difficult landing conditions. Nobody anticipated just how difficult those conditions would be. The strike launched perfectly. The aircraft flew 300 miles west, found the Japanese fleet at 1840 hours, and attacked immediately. They sank 1 carrier and damaged 2 others, plus a battleship and several cruisers. It was a successful strike, but the sun was setting. The return flight would be in darkness, and the American carriers were 300 miles away, far beyond the normal fuel range of most aircraft. The first aircraft began returning to Task Force 58 at approximately 20-30 hours. It was fully dark. The moon was not yet risen. The ocean was black. Pilots looked for their carriers and saw nothing but darkness broken occasionally by ships' wakes. Most pilots had never made a night carrier landing. Many had less than 100 hours of total flight time. They were exhausted from 5 hours of flying and combat. Their fuel was nearly gone, and they couldn't find their ships. Admiral Mitscher faced an impossible decision. Standard procedure during night operations was complete blackout, no lights, no radio transmissions, absolute darkness to hide the fleet from Japanese submarines and aircraft. But his pilots couldn't find the carriers in complete darkness. They would run out of fuel and crash into the ocean. Mitscher had to choose, maintain blackout and lose his pilots, or light up the fleet and risk submarine attack. At 20:45 hours, Mitscher gave an order that violated every rule of naval warfare. Turn on the lights. Every ship in Task Force 58 turned on running lights, searchlights, truck lights, any light they had. Carriers turned on flight deck lights, illuminated landing strips, pointed searchlights straight up to create beacons visible for 50 miles. The entire task force, over 100 ships, lit up like a city in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It was a submarine captain's dream target, but it was the only way to save the pilots. The pilots saw the lights and turned toward them, but now they faced a different problem. Most pilots couldn't identify which carrier was theirs. The carriers all looked similar. In darkness, they were indistinguishable. Pilots just headed for the nearest flight deck and tried to land. The result was chaos. Ensign Burnett, flying from USS Lexington, circled USS Enterprise because Enterprise's landing pattern was less crowded. He had no fuel margin for circling. His engine was running on fumes. He lowered his landing gear, dropped his tailhook, and committed to landing on Enterprise, even though it wasn't his ship. Standard procedure required radio clearance from the landing signal officer. Burnett didn't have time. He just came straight in. The landing signal officer on Enterprise saw an unknown aircraft approaching without clearance and waved him off. The signal to abort the landing and go around for another attempt. Burnett ignored the wave-off. He couldn't go around. His engine would quit if he tried to climb. He continued the approach, caught the arresting wire, and slammed onto Enterprise's deck. His engine died as the plane stopped. He had landed with literally zero fuel remaining. Burnett climbed out of his cockpit, expecting to be arrested for violating landing procedures. Instead, deck crew ran over and shouted, "Which carrier are you from?" Burnett said, "Lexington." They pointed to another carrier 2 miles away and yelled, "That's Lexington. This is Enterprise. You're on the wrong ship." Burnett looked around and saw aircraft from 6 different carriers on Enterprise's deck: F-6F Hellcats, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, all mixed together, all from different ships, all being frantically pushed aside to make room for more landing aircraft. The scene across Task Force 58 was controlled chaos. Aircraft were landing on any carrier they could reach. Flight decks designed to handle 40 aircraft were jammed with 60 or 70 planes from multiple carriers. Landing signal officers were waving off aircraft that ignored the signals and landed anyway. Pilots were ditching in the ocean next to carriers because they ran out of fuel while in the landing pattern. Some pilots deliberately ditched rather than risk a night carrier landing, a rational choice given that most had never landed on a carrier at night. On USS Lexington, the flight deck was a nightmare. Aircraft were landing every 20 seconds. Some had their landing gear damaged and couldn't lower their wheels. They belly landed on the deck, skidding to a stop, while deck crews scrambled to get them out of the landing area. Some had battle damage from anti-aircraft fire. One TBF Avenger landed with half its tail shot away, barely controllable, wobbling onto the deck and immediately ground-looped into a parked aircraft. The worst incidents were barrier crashes, when a landing aircraft missed all the arresting wires and couldn't stop. It hit the crash barrier, a heavy net designed to stop runaway planes. Most barrier crashes were survivable. But on this night, with aircraft landing constantly and fuel critically low, there was no time to properly reset the barrier between landings. Aircraft hit barriers that were incorrectly positioned or damaged from previous crashes. Several planes flipped forward over the barrier and crashed inverted onto the deck. On USS Bunker Hill, Lieutenant Junior Grade George Sargent brought his damaged F-6F in for landing with his tailhook shot away. Without a tailhook, he couldn't catch the arresting wires. He hit the deck, rolled forward, and slammed into the barrier at 60 knots. The barrier held, but the aircraft flipped forward and crashed upside down. Sargent was trapped in the inverted cockpit with fuel leaking around him. Deck crew rushed in with axes and crowbars, smashed the canopy open, and pulled him out seconds before the leaking fuel ignited. Sargent survived with a broken arm and severe burns. On USS Enterprise, the flight deck was blocked by crashed aircraft and planes from other carriers. The landing signal officer was waving off every incoming aircraft. The deck was full, no more room. But pilots running out of fuel ignored the wave-offs and landed anyway, crashing into parked aircraft, creating pileups of damaged planes. Enterprise's deck crew counted 47 aircraft on the flight deck, more than twice the normal capacity. They couldn't launch any aircraft because there was no room to position them for takeoff. Meanwhile, pilots who couldn't land were ditching in the ocean. A pilot would radio, "I'm out of fuel, ditching," and then simply put his plane down in the water next to whatever ship was closest. Night water landings were extremely dangerous. Pilots couldn't see the wave height or ocean surface. Many aircraft hit hard and broke apart. Pilots who survived the impact scrambled out of sinking aircraft and inflated life rafts, hoping to be picked up before they drifted away in the darkness. Destroyers throughout the task force were maneuvering to pick up downed pilots. USS Caperton, a destroyer on the fleet's edge, rescued 14 pilots in 2 hours. The ship would spot a life raft, maneuver alongside, throw lines, and haul the pilot aboard, then immediately move to the next raft. The destroyer's log recorded rescuing pilots from 6 different carriers, men who had ditched near whatever ship they happened to be circling when their fuel ran out. By 22 hours, all surviving aircraft were either landed or ditched. The butcher's bill was brutal. 49 aircraft lost, nearly 25% of the strike force. 20 crashed on carrier decks, 29 ditched in the ocean. 16 pilots and aircrew were dead, some killed in crashes, some drowned after ditching, some lost in the darkness and never found. 161 aircraft had landed safely, but many were damaged and on the wrong carriers. The flight decks of every carrier in Task Force 58 were chaos. As dawn broke on June 21st, the true scope of the disaster became clear. Nearly 50 aircraft lost, not to enemy action, but to fuel exhaustion and night landing accidents. 16 men dead, dozens injured, millions of dollars in aircraft destroyed. And for what? The strike had sunk 1 Japanese carrier and damaged a few other ships. Important, but not decisive. The Japanese fleet had escaped. Was the damage inflicted worth the losses sustained? The pilots thought not. As they gathered in squadron-ready rooms across Task Force 58, anger built. They had been sent on an impossible mission, 300 miles each way, leaving almost no fuel margin for combat or navigation errors. They had been told to expect difficult landings, but nobody had prepared them for returning in complete darkness to carriers they couldn't identify, with fuel gauges reading empty. Some pilots blamed Admiral Mitscher for launching the strike at extreme range. Others blamed Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Fifth Fleet, for not positioning the task force closer to the Japanese fleet. Still others blamed their own carrier captains for not providing better navigation aids or clearer landing instructions. The anger was unfocused but intense. What prevented the anger from becoming an actual mutiny was Mitscher's decision to turn on the lights. Every pilot knew that decision had saved lives. Standard doctrine required complete blackout at night. Mitscher had broken doctrine and accepted the risk of submarine attack to give his pilots a chance to find the carriers. That decision earned him loyalty from the pilots, even as they questioned the wisdom of launching the strike in the first place. But the tension was real. In squadron-ready rooms, junior officers openly criticized the mission planning. Some said they would refuse similar missions in the future. Senior officers shut down that talk immediately. Refusing orders was mutiny, punishable by court-martial. But the complaints continued in private. Letters home from pilots expressed bitterness about being risked unnecessarily. Morale was damaged. Admiral Spruance, commanding Fifth Fleet from his flagship USS Indianapolis, was aware of the pilots' anger. Spruance was a cautious, methodical officer who prioritized protecting the amphibious invasion force at Saipan over aggressively pursuing the Japanese fleet. His caution had prevented a decisive victory, but his caution had also prevented a potential disaster if the Japanese fleet had doubled back and attacked the invasion beaches. Spruance believed he had made the right decision. Many pilots disagreed. The Navy conducted an investigation into the night landing disaster. The report concluded that launching the strike at extreme range was justified by the opportunity to damage the Japanese fleet. The losses were regrettable but acceptable given the tactical situation. Mitscher's decision to turn on the lights was praised as showing concern for his pilots. No disciplinary action was taken against any officer, but the report didn't address the underlying question. Should carriers launch strikes at ranges that leave pilots with no fuel margin for error? The answer was complicated. Yes, if the target is worth the risk. No, if the losses outweigh the gains. The Battle of the Philippine Sea fell somewhere in between. Significant damage inflicted on the enemy, but at a cost that made pilots question whether their lives were being risked wisely. Among the chaos of that night, individual stories of skill, courage, and luck stood out. Lieutenant Commander Robert Winston, leading a torpedo bomber squadron from USS Enterprise, realized 20 minutes into the return flight that he didn't have enough fuel to reach the carriers. He calculated his options: push on and hope his fuel estimate was wrong, or ditch immediately while he still had engine power to control the landing. Winston chose to ditch. He radioed his wingmen, told them to continue without him, and put his TBF Avenger down in the ocean 100 miles from the task force. The landing was perfect. The aircraft hit smoothly, stayed intact long enough for the crew to escape, then sank. Winston and his 2 crewmen inflated their life raft and waited in darkness. They were rescued 14 hours later by a destroyer that found them through pure chance while searching for other downed pilots. Ensign Wilbur Webb, flying an F-6F Hellcat from USS Yorktown, returned to the task force with his wingman and couldn't find Yorktown in the darkness. His fuel was nearly gone. He circled, searching for his carrier, watching his fuel gauge drop. Finally, he saw a carrier with a clear deck and decided to land regardless of which ship it was. He came in on his approach, caught the wire, and landed smoothly. As he climbed out, deck crew asked which carrier he was from. He said Yorktown. They pointed across the water. "That's Yorktown. This is Wasp. You're on the wrong ship." Webb looked at his wingman, who had landed right behind him. They both shrugged. They were alive. They were on a carrier. Close enough. Lieutenant Thomas Harris, a dive bomber pilot from USS Lexington, had a different problem. He reached the task force with sufficient fuel, but couldn't find any carrier with a clear deck. Every ship he circled was waving him off. Decks too full, too many aircraft landing, no room. Harris circled for 30 minutes, watching his fuel gauge drop, getting desperate. Finally, he saw USS Essex repositioning aircraft to create landing space. Harris didn't wait for the clear deck signal. He just came straight in, landed, and hoped the landing signal officer wouldn't wave him off. The LSO did wave him off. Harris ignored it. He caught the wire, stopped on deck, and immediately the LSO was screaming at him for violating procedures. Harris shouted back, "I'm out of fuel. Where did you want me to land? The ocean." The LSO stopped yelling. Harris's aircraft had 8 gallons of fuel remaining, enough for maybe 2 minutes of flight. Ensign Donald Lewis had the worst landing of the night and survived. Lewis approached USS Bunker Hill in an SBD Dauntless dive bomber with battle damage that made the aircraft difficult to control. He came in too high, too fast, bounced over the first 3 arresting wires, caught the 4th wire, but his damaged tailhook broke. The aircraft rolled forward, hit the barrier at 50 knots, flipped inverted, and caught fire. Lewis was hanging upside down in his harness, with flames spreading around the cockpit. Deck crew reached him within seconds, cut the harness, pulled him out, and dragged him clear as the aircraft was engulfed in flames. Lewis suffered second-degree burns on his hands and face. His rear seat gunner died in the crash. Lewis was evacuated to a hospital ship, spent 6 weeks recovering, and never flew combat again. Lieutenant Junior Grade James Swope had perhaps the luckiest escape. Swope was flying an F-6F from USS Hornet. He ditched in the ocean after running out of fuel while circling. The water landing was rough. The aircraft hit hard, broke apart, and sank within seconds. Swope barely escaped the cockpit before the plane went under. He inflated his life vest and floated in the dark, alone, watching lights from the task force slowly moving away. He assumed he would drift for hours or days before being found, if he was found at all. 15 minutes later, a destroyer appeared out of the darkness, searchlight sweeping the water. The light found Swope almost immediately. He was pulled aboard USS Caperton 20 minutes after ditching, the fastest rescue of the night. Pure luck. The destroyer happened to be passing through that exact area searching for other pilots. Not everyone was lucky. Ensign Carl Johnson ditched his TBF Avenger near USS Lexington after his engine quit on final approach. The water landing was hard but survivable. Johnson and his 2 crewmen escaped the aircraft and inflated their life raft. They were 500 yards from Lexington, clearly visible in the carrier's lights. They waved and shouted, expecting immediate rescue. But Lexington was in the middle of landing operations, aircraft touching down every 30 seconds. The carrier couldn't stop to pick up survivors. Johnson's raft drifted away from the carrier. By the time a destroyer came looking, the raft was gone. Johnson and his crew were never found. The decision to launch the strike at extreme range sparked debate that continues among naval historians to this day. Was it the right call or a reckless gamble that cost unnecessary lives? Arguments in favor. The strike damaged the Japanese fleet at a critical moment. Sinking one carrier and damaging others reduced Japanese naval aviation capability even further after the Turkey shoot had already devastated their air groups. The Japanese fleet was retreating and might not be found again. The opportunity to strike had to be taken. Losing 49 aircraft and 16 men was acceptable given the strategic importance of crippling the Japanese carrier force. Arguments against the strike achieved minimal results compared to losses. One carrier sunk wasn't worth 49 aircraft and 16 men. The real damage to the Japanese fleet had already been done during the Turkey shoot. They lost 395 aircraft and most of their trained pilots. The follow-up strike added relatively little. The risk to American pilots was too high. Better to have let the Japanese fleet escape than to risk pilots on a marginal mission at extreme range. Admiral Spruance defended his decision. He argued that protecting the Saipan invasion force was his primary mission. Aggressively chasing the Japanese fleet would have pulled Task Force 58 away from Saipan, leaving the invasion vulnerable if the Japanese doubled back. His caution was prudent. The fact that his pilots suffered losses during the follow-up strike was regrettable, but not a reason to question the Ain-Naha overall strategy. Admiral Mitscher disagreed privately. Mitscher was an aggressive carrier commander who believed in taking risks to destroy enemy forces. He thought Spruance had been too cautious during the battle. If Task Force 58 had been positioned more aggressively, the strike could have been launched earlier in the day with better fuel margins. The night landing disaster was a consequence of Spruance's caution, delaying the strike until late afternoon. Mitscher never said this publicly. Military discipline prevented open criticism of superior officers. But his staff knew his views. The pilots had their own opinions. Most believed the strike shouldn't have been launched at such extreme range. Give them a mission with a reasonable fuel margin, they could execute it. Send them 300 miles with zero margin for error, they would have casualties regardless of enemy action. Some pilots expressed this view carefully in after-action reports. Others kept quiet, knowing that complaining about orders could damage their careers. Post-war analysis by the Naval War College examined the battle in detail. The analysis concluded that launching the strike was justified, but should have been accompanied by better contingency planning for night recoveries. Task Force 58 should have had procedures for emergency night landings, better navigation aids for pilots returning in darkness, and clearer instructions on landing priorities. The losses were partially due to inadequate preparation for a known risk. The comparison to other battles is instructive. At the Battle of Midway in 1942, American carriers launched strikes at extreme range and suffered heavy losses, primarily to Japanese fighters rather than fuel exhaustion. At the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942, American aircraft returned from strikes in difficult conditions and several ditched or crashed. Night operations were always dangerous. What made the Philippine Sea unique was the scale. Over 200 aircraft returning simultaneously in complete darkness, all low on fuel, many flown by inexperienced pilots. Modern naval doctrine reflects lessons learned from the Philippine Sea. Carrier strikes are planned with fuel margins that account for navigation errors, combat delays, and recovery problems. Night operations have dedicated training requirements. Pilots practice night carrier landings extensively before flying night missions. The Navy learned from the disaster and changed procedures to prevent similar casualties in future operations. The pilots who survived the night landing disaster continued flying combat missions throughout the rest of the war. Most gained experience and became competent night flyers. Some became exceptional. Ensign Robert Burnett, who landed on the wrong carrier, remained with USS Lexington's Air Group through the end of the war. He flew 87 combat missions total, participated in strikes against the Philippines, Formosa, and Okinawa. He never forgot the night of June 20th, 1944. In interviews decades later, he said that landing on Enterprise's deck with zero fuel remaining was the most terrifying moment of his life, more frightening than any combat mission. He left the Navy in 1946 and became a commercial pilot. He died in 1998 at age 77. Lieutenant Commander Robert Winston, who ditched deliberately to save his crew, was awarded the Navy Cross for his judgment and leadership. He returned to duty after his rescue and commanded a torpedo bomber squadron during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. He remained in the Navy after the war, eventually retiring as a captain in 1965. He often said that ditching in the ocean was the best decision he made during the war. Better to ditch with engine power than to push on and crash uncontrollably when the engine quit. Ensign Donald Lewis, who survived the burning crash on USS Bunker Hill, never fully recovered from his injuries. The burns on his hands left him with limited mobility in his fingers. He was medically retired from the Navy in 1945. He worked as an aircraft mechanic in civilian life, despite his injuries. He rarely discussed the crash. His family said he had nightmares about being trapped in the burning cockpit for the rest of his life. He died in 1982 at age 59. The 16 men who died during the night landing disaster are memorialized at various locations. Some have graves in military cemeteries. Their bodies were recovered from crashed aircraft or found floating in life rafts. Others are listed as lost at sea, their bodies never recovered. Their names are inscribed on memorial walls at the Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C., and at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Hawaii. Admiral Mitscher continued commanding carrier task forces through the rest of the war. He was beloved by his pilots for turning on the lights to save them during the night landing disaster. That decision defined his reputation, an admiral who cared about his pilots and would take risks to bring them home. Mitscher commanded Task Force 58 during the battles of the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. He died in 1947 of a heart attack at age 60, worn out by the stress of command during 3 years of war. Admiral Spruance commanded Fifth Fleet through the remainder of the Pacific War. His cautious, methodical approach was criticized by aggressive officers like Mitscher and Halsey, but was respected by others who valued protecting objectives over seeking glory. Spruance's caution at the Philippine Sea prevented the Japanese from threatening the Saipan invasion. Whether that justifies the casualties suffered during the night landing operation remains debated. Spruance retired in 1948 and died in 1969 at age 83. The night landing disaster after the Battle of the Philippine Sea taught the U.S. Navy several critical lessons about carrier operations and risk management. First, fuel margins matter. Launching strikes at extreme range leaves pilots vulnerable to any problem, navigation errors, combat delays, weather changes. The Navy began calculating fuel margins more conservatively, ensuring pilots had reserves for contingencies. Second, night operations require specialized training. Most pilots in 1944 had minimal night flying experience. The Navy established dedicated night carrier qualifications and required extensive training before pilots flew night combat missions. Third, emergency procedures need to be practiced. Task Force 58 had no established procedure for mass night recoveries. Improvisation worked but cost lives. The Navy developed standardized procedures for emergency recoveries, including lighting protocols, landing priorities, and destroyer rescue operations. Fourth, command decisions have human costs. Mitscher's decision to launch the strike and Spruance's cautious positioning of the fleet both contributed to the disaster. Leaders must balance mission objectives against risks to their people. Sometimes the mission is worth the risk. Sometimes it isn't. The judgment call is what separates good commanders from great ones. Fifth, small acts of leadership matter. Mitscher's decision to turn on the lights violated doctrine, but saved lives. That decision earned loyalty from pilots who otherwise might have become demoralized by the losses. Leaders who show they care about their people build trust that survives disasters. The disaster also revealed the limits of carrier aviation in 1944. Aircraft range, fuel capacity, and pilot endurance created constraints that couldn't be overcome through courage alone. Technology improved throughout the war. Better aircraft with longer range, better navigation aids, better training. But on June 20th, 1944, those improvements hadn't arrived yet. Pilots and aircraft were pushed to their limits and beyond. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe and share this video. These stories matter because they show the human cost of command decisions and the courage of ordinary people facing impossible situations. The night landing disaster after the Battle of the Philippine Sea was one of the worst single-day losses in American carrier aviation history. 49 aircraft and 16 men lost not to enemy action, but to fuel exhaustion and night landing accidents. It happened because an admiral made a difficult decision to launch a strike at extreme range, betting that the damage to the enemy would justify the risk to his pilots. The pilots who flew that mission were young men, most in their early 20s, many with less than a year of experience. They launched into twilight, flew 300 miles to find and attack the Japanese fleet, fought through anti-aircraft fire, and returned in complete darkness to carriers they couldn't find with fuel gauges reading empty. They improvised, they adapted, they landed on any carrier they could reach or ditched in the ocean and hoped for rescue. Their courage kept the mission from becoming an even worse disaster. Ensign Robert Burnett landed on the wrong carrier and survived with zero fuel remaining. Lieutenant Commander Robert Winston ditched deliberately to save his crew. Ensign Donald Lewis survived a burning crash. Lieutenant James Swope was rescued 15 minutes after ditching through pure luck. 16 others weren't lucky. They crashed, drowned, or drifted away in darkness and were never found. Admiral Mitscher made the decision that defined his legacy: turn on the lights. Standard doctrine said maintain blackout. Mitscher said save the pilots. He accepted the risk of submarine attack to give his men a chance to find the carriers. That decision prevented total disaster. It also earned him loyalty from pilots who knew their admiral would risk his fleet to bring them home. The debate about whether the strike should have been launched continues. Was sinking one Japanese carrier worth 49 American aircraft and 16 men? Reasonable people disagree. What's certain is that the pilots who flew the mission did their duty, faced impossible conditions with courage, and paid a price that should never be forgotten. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was a decisive American victory. The Japanese lost 395 aircraft during the Turkey Shoot and 3 carriers over 2 days of battle. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. But victory came with costs. The pilots who died on the night of June 20th, 1944, were casualties of friendly fire, killed not by enemy action, but by fuel exhaustion, darkness, and the inherent dangers of carrier aviation pushed to its limits. Visit a naval aviation museum if you can. See the F-6F Hellcats, SBD Dauntlesses, and TBF Avengers that pilots flew during the Pacific War. Stand next to these aircraft and realize how small they were, how cramped the cockpits, how limited the instrumentation. Then imagine flying 300 miles over open ocean in darkness, with your fuel gauge reading empty, searching desperately for a carrier you can't see, knowing you have minutes before your engine quits. That's what the pilots of Task Force 58 faced on June 20th, 1944. Most survived. 49 aircraft and 16 men didn't. Remember them. Thank you for watching. Please comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We preserve these stories because the courage, sacrifice, and difficult decisions of people 80 years ago shaped the world we live in today. These pilots deserved better than to die from fuel exhaustion after defeating the enemy. They deserve to be remembered for the courage they showed when their leaders asked them to do the impossible.